Our story so far, we have left in the middle of a hot debate. The first Tosfos in Shas, the first Machlokas Rishonim in the Talmud, concerning a matter of basic practice, every night practice, literally, potentially every night. And it impacts on a lot of things connected to it as well. That the Mishnah had told us the various times that are relevant to nighttime Kriya Shema. And in that context, almost you don't notice it because it focuses so much more in the Mishnah on the back half, on the latest times for Kriya Shema. We don't pay attention to the fact that it starts off with Me'e Masai. When is the earliest time for Kriya Shema? When can you start? And the Mishnah tells us a time which is hard to interpret from the Mishnah, but the Gemara is going to tell us means Seisa Kochav. Only when it's fully dark. As we mentioned, well, eventually, when we get to Daf Beis and Beis, God willing, whatever that is, we'll talk about that issue of nighttime starting, about Seisa Kochavim and Shkia and Ben Hashmashos and all of that. But for now, we know that there is a process tonight, and it's only fully night when we've reached Seisa Kochavim, whatever that means, when the stars are fully out. So if that's the case, if that's the earliest time for Kriya Shema, so then we have a major question on our practice. Because very often, we see it at least Friday night, if not other times. We see it other times as well. Ma'ariv is davened when it is not Seisa Kochav. And it's going to be mentioned that in the time of the Rishonim, it's probably even more common than it was now. Because this is not a new question. At the time of the Rishonim, they didn't have street lights. So all the more so. They'd be likely to want to be home by the time it was fully dark and not be out on the streets. So therefore, all the more so, shul would be taking place when it's still light outside. And apparently that's acceptable in terms of when Ma'ariv is davened, as far as the Shemona Esrei is concerned. But what about the fact that we say Shema during that time? So according to our Mishnah, it's too early for Shema. So how do we deal with that? So this is what we started to see was a big debate between Rashi and Tosfos and other Rishonim, and that our practice doesn't follow either Rashi or Tosfos.
So, just what are you suggesting, that we should sometimes daven Ma'ariv without saying Shema at all?
No, not actually suggesting that, but why not? That's the question the Rishonim are dealing with. That either we shouldn't be allowed to daven Ma'ariv early, which someone could come to that conclusion. For example, if there's a strong focus on Smicha School with Tefillah, and understanding that it has to be when you're Yotzei Kriya Shema, the Kriya Shema, then your real Kriya Shema has to lead into Shemona Esrei. So one could certainly take that position. And especially when it comes to Shacharis, and we're talking about this when we get into the Sugya Smicha School with Tefillah, so there are certainly even stronger opinions that Shacharis should only be davened when you can say Kriya Shema together with Shemona Esrei. So one could take that stance. Other possibility could be like you're describing, although that you don't see in practice so much. You don't really see anybody nowadays doing that. And that if they're davening Ma'ariv early, they would be skipping Shema. But the question is not, should we do that, but why don't we do that? So if that doesn't seem to be a time when Shema is a possibility, so why are we davening then? It's really two questions. When are we fulfilling Kriya Shema if that's too early? And what are we accomplishing by saying Shema during a time when we're apparently not fulfilling the mitzvah? So Rashi's view, as we saw, is that yes, like the Mishnah sounds, we're not Yotzei Kriya Shema when we daven early. So then he's left then with two questions. So why do we bother, and what do we do? So he says in terms of why do we bother, that's a topic we didn't spend much time on. We'll probably not spend much more time on it tonight either, but that it's essentially like Ashrei. We have a desire that we don't want to start davening in the middle of nothing. We don't want to start davening in an attitude which may not be conducive, whether it's a frivolity, whether it's distraction, whether it's sadness, anything that's not conducive to davening. Is a Mishnah in the beginning of the 5th parak. We don't want to jump into davening in the wrong context. So therefore, we have an idea of starting tefillah mitoch divrei Torah. So even the Divrei Torah, we don't want it to be sos and resivus and a fancy machlokas that's going to distract us. We want it to be something a little more straightforward. It's not going to consume our attention. So Mincha, we choose Ashrei. It's perfect. There's an issue, there's a recommendation of saying Ashrei 3 times a day anyway, and it serves the purpose, so it works great. So Ma'ariv, we should technically have something like that also. So apparently Kriya Shema serves that purpose. And if it's not fulfilling the mitzvah of Kriya Shema, it's at least only doing that. So normally, if you're davening Ma'ariv late, and nowadays davening 7:45 is already late, this time of year, so you have both Kriya Shema, the mitzvah, and Tefillah Mitot Divrei Torah. And if it's too early for the mitzvah of Kriya Shema, at least you have the Ashrei function of Shema. So that's in terms of that part. But the other part he's got to deal with is, so when do we fulfill the mitzvah? What about the mitzvah Minat Torah of Shema? So Rashi says, and as we noted, if you stop at this line, he would be the winner of this debate, because this would reflect our practice. It says Rashi, okay, in Lava Kardos of Eisa Knesset, Yalama Tu Mitot Divrei Torah, therefore, we have a responsibility to read it again after it becomes fully dark. So if that was all he said, that's fine, that's what we do. Right? We announced after Ma'ariv that Friday night we'd have Ma'ariv early, we announced afterwards, make sure to recite Kriya Shema after whatever time it says. That's what Rashi is reflecting here. The controversial part is that he takes it a little bit further and he says something which is more debatable. But the Kriya Shema, the Kriyas Parsha Rishona, Shel Adam Kari Al Mitaso Yatsa, that with the one Parsha of Kriya Shema that a person recites on his bed, Kriya Shema Lamita, so with that he fulfills the mitzvah of Kriya Shema. So apparently he pushed his luck too far, because now it's controversial. Had he just stopped there, would have been the winner. But that Tosfos doesn't like the whole story, but here neither of them win. So Tosfos says, I don't understand. Tosfos has 4 questions on this approach. And essentially, in terms of the structure of this debate, so you see Tosfos is focusing specifically on Rashi's backup plan, as opposed to his premise. And we discussed this a little last week and discussed it with Simcha before, whether we could say more than this, that really he is attacking the premise, because maybe since the practice is to daven early, so we have to assume somehow the practice makes sense, especially in light of one of the 4 questions he asked, we'll mention in a second. So maybe Tosfos is coming from a fundamental point of view. But Tosfos has essentially 4 questions on Rashi. Question 1 is, again, not a surprise to Rashi, but it's not, you're not saying the whole Kriya Shema, you're only saying one paragraph. So how is it that you can fulfill the mitzvah with just one paragraph? So apparently, to that you have to say that Rashi apparently feels that you only need one paragraph to be Yosef. Maybe Rashi feels that that's the mitzvah Minat Torah. So even if it is a mitzvah Minat Torah, it's still hard to understand, because the mitzvah D'Rabbanan is to say more than that. So why isn't Rashi concerned about that? So apparently, like some of the Achronim suggest, you have to say that he's willing to rely on the earlier time for the D'Rabbanan Kriya Shema, but for the mitzvah Minat Torah of Kriya Shema, it's not enough. Sorry.
Is that only at night or in the morning also? Rashi would say that the rice is only one paragraph.
So the general machlokes we talked about a little last week about what is Kriya Shema Minat Torah, essentially at least 4 views, whether it's the first pasuk, the first parsha, first 2 parshas, or the whole package, and the whole package, different ways of understanding why. So it's interesting, you don't see those who distinguish between nighttime and daytime as far as that. It seems to be generally assumed that the severity or the weight of the mitzvah of Kriya Shema is equal when it comes to Kriya Shema of the daytime and Kriya Shema of the nighttime. The issue of Smichas Gula Tefillah, which is a factor in some of our decisions, that is much stronger in the morning than it is in the evening. Eventually we'll look at that sugya directly. But the Kriya Shema part of the component seems to be pretty much across the board. So as far as we know, any position that a Rishon takes on how much of it is Minat Torah, apparently he holds nighttime, daytime, same thing. This is machlokas, whether it's one mitzvah or 2. We talked about that a little bit last week, the Ramban and the Rambam, whether it's one mitzvah of Kriya Shema in 2 slots or 2 separate mitzvahs. But again, either way, it seems to be that they're treating both of them equally, either as 2 halves of one mitzvah or one mitzvah twice. Same kind of story. So that issue of one parsha is one of the questions that Tosfos has. The second issue is there's no Brochas. So again, the role of Brochos in Kriya Shema is also a little bit of an unclear point. We don't really necessarily have to assume that what we call Birchos Kriya Shema are really the Brachos for Kriya Shema. So also an open issue in the Rishonim a little bit. But that seems to bother Tosfos. The third issue is that, and this is what Simcha was mentioning, maybe does make the issue a little bit more principled here, that in terms of a key point, rather than just arguing on the backup plan, is that the Gemara has a dispute about Smichas Gula Tefillah, about the idea that we want Shema to lead into Shemona Esrei, Gal Yisrael to lead into Shemona Esrei. So we know, everyone agrees, we have to have that for Shachris. So Machlokas in the Gemara and Daf Daled, do we need that also for Ma'ariv? So we paskin yes. So the thrust of paskin yes is that the tefillah should be structured the way we have it. That we first have Shema and then have Shemona Esrei. Because the other opinion was that we should have what the Gemara calls tefillos be'emtza tiknun. That we should have a Shema in the morning, first thing of the day, Shema the last thing of the day, and the 3 Shemona Esreis of the day will be in between the 2 Shmas. So we reject that opinion. We follow the view that Smichas Gula Tefillah. So Tosfos is worried that according to Rashi's perspective, so what do you have? You have the Shemona Esrei that was done when you went to shul, and later on the mitzvah of Kriya Shema. That's the view in the Gemara that we don't follow. So what was the point of that whole debate if we're going to go back to this view that didn't win? So as Simcha was suggesting, so therefore if that's really a concern, so then maybe that's why Tosfos is asking Rashi that the backup plan is fundamentally untenable, and therefore we have to assume that you are fulfilling Kriya Shema at that time, again assuming that the practice, which was probably a very widespread practice of all of Klal Yisrael, as is still today, has got to have some basis for it. The fourth issue is the vaguest of the issues. That the Tosfos says that Kriya Shema Lamita seems to be what's bothering them, is it's not really a chiyuv anyway. That the Gemara says that it's a protection, that we do it because of damaging forces and mazikin, and that a Talmid Chacham doesn't have to. So whatever the thrust of that question is, not 100% clear.
Is it on the Mitzvah that people didn't do it? I didn't understand.
Right, so that's what's not clear about the question. Maybe that is, and Tziv, I think, understood it that way. Tziv in his commentary to Shas, Romei Sadeh, that maybe just people aren't going to do it. But again, that doesn't have to be a problem either. You could say, okay, so maybe if you daven on time, daven late enough, you wouldn't do it. But if you needed to, you would. Okay, it's not clear why this bothers Tosfos so much. It seems, on one level, their point seems to be that how can you tell me this is the mitzvah of Kriya Shema when the Gemara is so clear that this is not on the same level as Kriya Shema? Okay, it's not the most devastating of the 4 questions. But for all of these reasons, sorry?
Even though the Gemara later on says there's some people who don't have to say it.
Right, but that seems to be one angle it's coming from, but you could say that you don't have to say it if you were raised in Kriya Shema. But if you need it to be Yotzi or Kriya Shema, then probably you should say it. So what is Tosfos worried about? That just therefore they won't say it, and we're only coming afterwards? It's a little hard to understand what the nature of the objection is. But okay, on some level, this bothers them as well. So for all of the above reasons, says Tosfos, this doesn't work. So Tosfos has the other approach, that essentially, against what it sounds like in the Mishnah, so we are in fulfillment of Kriya Shema even when we daven early. So how does that work? How do we make that make sense? So there's 2 approaches. One approach is that of the Ri, and the other is that of Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam is the one that really opens up a whole can of worms. So we'll mention the Ri first. The Ri's opinion is that maybe we don't paskin Teisa Kochavim. As we'll see when we look at the Gemara, that there are a number of different other alternative views as to when Shema starts. Different markers also similar to when the Kohanim go to eat, when a poor person goes to eat, when an average person goes to eat. Little vague markers of how to measure time. But maybe we paskin like one of these other opinions, and it's not really the case that we have to wait for Teisa Kochavim. That it could be somewhat earlier than Teisa Kochavim. The other view, yeah.
What time?
So how do you figure out what time it is? Right?
Yeah, in other words, we quote the Gemara about David Kamar Abed David Kamar Abed.
That's the other answer. That's Rabbeinu Tam.
Oh.
Yeah. So that's where it opens up a whole other discussion. So the Ri's answer is that just remove the border a little bit, that it's not Teisa Kochavim, it's earlier. It's hard to relate to that a little bit because we don't know exactly what that time is, and say in practice that somehow we're relying on hitting it sounds a little bit shaky. So Rabbeinu Tam's view is a little more complex and provoked a lot of debate. Rabbeinu Tam says essentially as follows. In the 4th parak of Brochas, God willing, we'll get there soon. So there is a debate. A lot of people learn this in 6th grade, so maybe it's from